All right, so get ready for a seriously mind-bending deep dive today.
Yeah, we're going deep down the rabbit hole this time.
Because we're tackling a question that's kind of out there, even for us.
Which is saying
You're
something.
talking about consciousness, that thing that makes you you.
The feeling of awareness, of experiencing the world.
Exactly. And whether it all boils down to just electrical signals in the brain or, get this,
Yeah.
something even weirder.
Quantum physics. We're going there.
We are, and we've got a stack of sources on this.
Oh,
Really.
yeah, some seriously mind-bending stuff suggesting something might be happening in these tiny little structures inside our brain cells called microtubules.
Microtubules. Okay, so we're going subatomic into the brain here.
Yeah, think of it like this. We're going full-on detective mode.
I love when we do that. What are the clues this time?
Well, we've got physics, a bit of biology, even some AI thrown in the mix.
All right, so where do we even start with something this complex? Who are the main players in this mystery of the mind?
We've got to start with the big guns. Sir Roger Penrose, a total rock star physicist.
I've heard the name.
And Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist. Now, this might seem like an odd pairing.
Yeah, how do those two fields even connect?
That's the beauty of this deep dive, right? But they're the duo behind a theory called orchestrated objective reduction, or OR for short.
Orch.
It suggests that consciousness, that feeling of awareness, arises from quantum processes happening inside those microtubules we mentioned.
Okay, so already my mind is starting to bend a little.
Just a little.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty of how microtubules could even be involved in something as complex as consciousness, let's talk about Penrose.
Okay, so Penrose starts with this really bold idea.
Like, what kind of bold are we talking?
He argues that the human mind, our brains, can grasp mathematical truths that are, get this, beyond the reach of any computer.
Wait, really? You mean like some kind of super advanced math that only humans can understand?
Well, not understand it in the traditional sense. It's more like there are mathematical truths that are impossible to prove using simple step-by-step logic.
And computers use that kind of logic, right? Like even the most advanced ones.
Exactly. Even the fanciest supercomputer is basically following a set of rules, a program.
Okay, but how can something be true if you can't prove it? That doesn't make sense.
That's the heart of what's called Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Gödel. Now, there's a name I haven't heard in a while.
It's a bit of a brain twister, but imagine you have a book of mathematical rules, right?
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And one of those rules states, this rule cannot be proven true within this book.
Wait, so it's saying it can't be proven, but if it's in the book, isn't it already true?
Bingo! You got it. It's a paradox, and that's Gödel's whole point.
So how does a mathematical paradox connect to our brains?
Well, Penrose says that mathematicians often have these intuitive leaps, those aha moments where they just grasp the truth of a concept.
Right, like it just clicks.
And he argues that if our brains were just classical computers, just following a set of rules, we wouldn't have those moments of insight.
So he's saying our brains are doing something more, something beyond just crunching numbers like a computer.
That's the idea. And he thinks the answer might lie in the strange world of quantum mechanics.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. The quantum realm, where things can be in multiple states at once, maybe that's the key to our brain's super-thinking abilities.
Precisely. Penrose believes that the weirdness of the quantum world might explain how we make those non-computable leaps in thinking.
Okay, fascinating stuff. But how do we even begin to test that idea? It's not like we can just crack open a skull and observe quantum mechanics in action. Or can we?
That's where our anesthesiologist Hameroff and those microtubules come in.
Right, anesthesia. What do those have to do with quantum consciousness?
It's all about how anesthetics work. They disrupt microtubules.
Hold on, I thought microtubules were just like tiny skeletons inside our cells. What do they have to do with being conscious?
That's what's so wild about this. Hameroff noticed that every gas used in anesthesia, the stuff that makes you temporarily unconscious, all messed with microtubules in some way.
So it's like finding an off switch for awareness by messing with these microtubules.
That's the idea. It made him suspect the microtubules were far more than just structural supports.
Okay, so they're doing double duty, maybe even triple duty, inside our cells. But what makes anyone think these microtubules could be doing anything even remotely close to what a computer does?
Well, picture this. Microtubules are like a network of tiny tubes spanning the entire cell.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But instead of carrying, say, water or nutrients, they might be carrying information.
Information, like what kind of information? How does it get transmitted through these tiny tubes?
That's where the quantum part gets seriously interesting and where this whole thing might just blow your mind.
Hit me with it.
So, Hameroff, he proposed that information could be stored in those microtubules, like a binary code, but on a molecular level.
So it's like Morse code, but way, way smaller.
Exactly. But hold on to your hats because it gets wilder.
I'm ready. Lay it on me.
Remember how in the quantum world, things can be in multiple states at once, that whole superposition thing?
Right, like a coin spinning in the air, both heads and tails at the same time until it lands.
Perfect analogy. Well, Hameroff and Penrose, they believe those microtubules, those tiny tubes, could also exist in superposition, meaning they could be in multiple states simultaneously.
Okay, now my brain is officially starting to hurt. Multiple states at once inside our brains. That just sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It would be if it weren't for another bizarre quantum phenomenon, entanglement.
Entanglement. Oh boy, here we go.
It's where two or more quantum particles become linked, intertwined, even if they're far apart. Imagine two coins flipping in perfect sync no matter how far apart they are.
Okay, that's spooky. But how do entangled coins or particles relate to our brainy microtubules?
Well, remember how those microtubules are made of even smaller units called tubulin?
Right, tubulin. Those building blocks that could be in those multiple states?
Well, Hameroff and Penrose believe that these tubulin units within a microtubule could be entangled with each other across the entire microtubule network.
So it's like a massive network of entangled superposition tubulin all within our neurons.
Yeah.
Okay, things just went from 0 to 60 real quick.
And here's where their theory, or Gerard, comes full circle.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here.
They believe those entangled tubulin states, spread across those huge networks of microtubules, are constantly collapsing from the superposition into a single state, kind of like those spinning coins finally landing on heads or tails.
Collapsing, like those quantum possibilities suddenly snapping into one concrete reality.
Exactly. And it's these collapses happening trillions of times per second across all those microtubules that they believe gives rise to consciousness.
Whoa, okay. So each tiny collapse is like a spark of awareness, and our consciousness is like a symphony of these quantum events happening every second.
That's the gist of their theory, yeah. Wild, right?
Wild doesn't even begin to describe it.
Yeah.
But this is still very much theory, right?
Absolutely. And a highly debated one at that.
I can imagine. But before we dive into all the criticisms and the counter-arguments, you mentioned earlier something about evidence for this microtubule quantum action. Tell me more about that.
Right. Back in 2013, some researchers found that microtubules could actually conduct electrical energy in a way that regular physics couldn't quite explain.
So like a superhighway of information flow within our brains.
That's the idea. And not just over short distances, we're talking potentially across entire neurons.
Hold on. Are you saying that microtubules might be like the brain's own super-fast internet working way faster than those regular nerve impulses?
It's a possibility, and it's this long-range coherence that makes these microtubules such good candidates for quantum information processing.
Okay, I need a minute to process this. We've got potential quantum computers in our brains, communicating faster than we thought possible.
Exactly.
This is already a lot to take in. But it gets even more interesting, right? Because you said there was new evidence, something about superradiance. What is that, and how does it fit into all of this?
You're right. The plot definitely thickens, and this is where things get really fascinating, even for those who are a little skeptical of the whole quantum consciousness idea. Remember how we said that microtubules are made up of those smaller units called tubulin?
Yeah, those tubulin molecules, the ones that might hold information and be in multiple states at once.
Well, scientists recently took a closer look at these tubulin molecules, specifically at a type of amino acid within them called tryptophan. You know how we were saying earlier how anesthetics can put you under by disrupting those microtubules?
Yeah, like flipping a switch.
Well, it turns out that anesthetics also mess with tryptophan, which is pretty interesting in itself.
Okay, so tryptophan, microtubules, anesthetics, consciousness. Are you starting to see a pattern here?
It's like all these pieces are starting to fit together, right? But here's the really cool part. When scientists exposed these microtubules to a specific type of light, the tryptophan molecules inside them started exhibiting something called superradiance.
Superradiance. Okay, that sounds intense. Like, what even is that?
So imagine you shine a light on a glow-in-the-dark toy, right? It absorbs that light and then re-emits it slowly, which is why it appears to glow. That's fluorescence.
Okay, makes sense.
Superradiance is similar, but instead of those individual atoms and the toy emitting light randomly, they do it together, all in sync.
So it's like a coordinated light show instead of a bunch of random flashes.
Exactly. It's like a chorus hitting that high note perfectly in unison, compared to a bunch of people singing different tunes at random.
Okay, I get the analogy. It's a much stronger, more powerful burst of light when they all work together.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Superradiance is a purely quantum phenomenon.
Meaning it can't be explained by classical physics.
You got it. It only happens if the particles involved, in this case those tryptophan molecules, are entangled. That spooky action at a distance we talked about earlier.
No way. So this research is showing that this large-scale entanglement that Penrose and Hameroff predicted might actually be happening within these microtubules.
It's looking more and more likely. And what's even more mind-blowing is that they found these super radiant states, this coordinated quantum behavior, extended further along the microtubules than they initially thought possible, even in the chaotic environment of a living cell.
So not only are these potential quantum computers in our brains potentially real, but they might be way more interconnected than we ever imagined. Okay, I need a minute to wrap my head around this. This is some next-level stuff.
It is. And you know what's really interesting?
What's that?
This all has some really big implications for artificial intelligence. We'll dive into that right after this quick break.
So we've got these microscopic structures, microtubules, potentially acting as quantum computers spread throughout our brains.
And we've got some pretty compelling evidence suggesting that they might be using quantum entanglement to do some pretty amazing information processing.
Okay, so let's talk about consciousness, because that's the real mystery here, right? We can talk about neurons firing and microtubules vibrating, but how do we even begin to explain that feeling of being you, of experiencing the world, having thoughts, feelings, all of it?
It's the question, isn't it? The million-dollar question.
And one that's had philosophers scratching their heads for centuries.
Exactly, and there's no easy answer.
But that's why we're here, right? To dive into the deep end of these mysteries.
That's what we do, and this is where that Orch OR theory, as out there as it might seem to some, starts to get really interesting.
Okay, so remind me again how those quantum collapses in microtubules are supposed to create something as complex as consciousness.
Well, imagine, right, each of those collapses happening trillions of times per second across the brain as a tiny spark of awareness, a blip of experience.
Okay, so it's not that any single collapse equals a thought or a feeling, but rather it's the sum total of all these collapses happening in this incredibly complex system.
You got it. These orchestrated collapses across this vast network of microtubules give rise to something way more than just the sum of their parts.
So it's like, I don't know, a symphony of quantum events.
Yeah.
And our conscious experience is the music that emerges from this incredibly complex interplay of sound.
I like that analogy, the music of consciousness.
Right. But this is still very theoretical, right? I mean, it's a beautiful idea, but do we have any actual evidence to support this?
That's the thing. We do have some intriguing research that suggests microtubules are playing a much bigger role in consciousness than just being structural scaffolding for the cell.
Yeah, you mentioned something earlier about anesthetics, and that's got to be more than just a coincidence, right? You don't just randomly bring up anesthetics in a conversation about quantum consciousness.
Well, remember how we talked about Stuart Hameroff, the anesthesiologist, and how he was fascinated by the way anesthesia works?
Yeah, like what's actually happening in the brain when we go under.
Exactly. Well, he noticed something really interesting about those gases they use to put people under during surgery.
The stuff that makes you temporarily unconscious.
That's the one, and it all pointed back to microtubules.
Okay, so messing with microtubules messes with consciousness.
Mhm.
I've established that. But how?
Well, it turns out that anesthetics don't just disrupt the function of microtubules.
What else are they doing?
They also mess with tryptophan. Remember how we were talking about tryptophan earlier?
Yeah, that amino acid found in turkey that makes you sleepy after Thanksgiving dinner.
That's the one. But it's also a crucial building block for many proteins, including tubulin, which, as we know, is what those microtubules are made of.
Okay, so we've got anesthetics, which knock you out, messing with tryptophan, which is a key component of microtubules, which might be those quantum computers in our brains.
You're connecting the dots. It's like we're piecing together a puzzle here.
Right, it's all starting to come together.
And it gets even wilder.
Hit me with it, because at this point, I'm ready for anything.
So remember those experiments we talked about earlier where scientists found evidence of quantum resonance in microtubules?
Yeah, suggesting that they could be capable of that super fast communication.
Well, those same researchers, they recently did some more digging into those tubulin molecules, and what they found is, well, that's kind of mind-blowing.
Lay it on me.
When they exposed these microtubules to a very specific type of ultraviolet light, the tryptophan molecules inside them, those same molecules that are affected by anesthetics, started exhibiting something called superradiance.
Superradiance. That sounds intense. Is that like fluorescence, but on steroids or something?
It's like fluorescence's cooler quantum cousin.
Yeah, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me.
So imagine you shine a light on a glow-in-the-dark toy. Right.
Right. It absorbs the light and then slowly releases it, giving it that cool glow.
That's fluorescence, individual atoms emitting light in random directions. But superradiance, it's like all those atoms decide to work together and release their light at the same time in the same direction.
So it's like synchronized glowing.
Exactly. It's a much brighter, more intense burst of light, almost like a tiny laser beam.
Okay, that's pretty cool. But how does this superradiance thing relate to our brains and consciousness?
Here's where it gets really interesting. Superradiance is a purely quantum phenomenon, meaning it can't happen unless the particles involved, in this case, those tryptophan molecules within the tubulin, are entangled.
Entangled, like those spooky action at a distance pairs we talked about earlier.
The one and only. Remember how we said that microtubules might be these networks of entangled tubulin units all vibrating in multiple states at once? Well, the superradiance thing just provided even more evidence to support that theory. It's like those tryptophan molecules were just waiting for the right kind of light to show off their quantum dance moves.
So this research adds another layer to the argument that microtubules are doing something incredibly special in our brains, something that could be fundamental to consciousness.
It's definitely a big deal, and it really throws a wrench into the idea that our brains are just classical computers crunching ones and zeros.
It's like our brains are running a whole different kind of software, one that we're only just beginning to understand.
Precisely. And it opens up a whole new set of questions about how we approach artificial intelligence. If our brains are using these quantum processes to generate consciousness, what does that mean for our attempts to create artificial consciousness? Are we on the right track with our current approaches, or do we need to fundamentally rethink how we're building these intelligent machines?
Right. We've got those who are saying you need quantum mechanics for real consciousness, and then we have the AI folks who are like, hold my beer, we're getting there with the good old-fashioned computer power.
It's the ultimate showdown. Quantum physics versus AI, two titans of science battling it out for the future of consciousness. We'll dive into that debate and explore some of the amazing advancements in AI right after the break.
So where do we even go from here? We've gone from tiny microtubules in the brain to the very nature of reality itself. It's like Alice down the rabbit hole, but instead of tea parties and talking cats, we've got quantum physics and the mystery of consciousness.
And the deeper we go, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
Which, honestly, I kind of love. It keeps things interesting.
Absolutely. It's what drives scientific inquiry.
So let's say, just for the fun of it, that this whole quantum consciousness idea is right on the money.
Okay, I'll bite. What if it is?
What does that mean for us, for our understanding of what it means to be human, to experience the world, to exist in this quantum soup of reality?
Now you're getting to the really big questions.
The ones that keep you up at night.
Exactly. Because if consciousness really is a product of these quantum processes, as Penrose and Hameroff suggest, then it suggests a very different view of ourselves and the universe.
Okay, I'm listening. Walk me through this.
Well, think about it this way. Right now, we tend to see ourselves as separate from the world, right? Like our minds are these internal spaces, and then there's external reality out there.
Right, like our senses are taking in information, feeding it to our brains, and that's how we experience things.
Exactly. But what if it's not that simple? What if our consciousness isn't just a passive observer of reality, but an active participant in shaping it?
Okay, now you're going full The Matrix on me.
Maybe a little, but remember the observer effect in quantum mechanics, how just observing something can affect its behavior?
Yeah, like in that double-slit experiment where those particles act like waves or particles depending on whether you're watching them or not.
Right. And the traditional interpretation is that it's the act of measuring, of interacting with those particles that forces them to choose a state to become either wave-like or particle-like.
Okay, but you're about to throw a quantum wrench into that interpretation, aren't you?
Maybe just a little one. Because if Orch OR is right, and our consciousness itself is a quantum phenomenon, then it's not just the measuring device influencing those particles, it's our conscious decision to make the measurement in the first place that's playing a role.
Hold on, are you saying that my mind, my intention, could be collapsing those wave functions, not some fancy lab equipment?
It's a radical idea, but that's one of the mind-blowing implications of this whole quantum consciousness thing. If our awareness, our subjective experience is rooted in these quantum events, then our minds might be way more intertwined with reality than we ever imagined.
Okay, so it's less like we're watching the universe unfold and more like we're part of the band,
Hmm.
playing along and influencing the music.
I like that analogy. Our conscious experience might be less like watching a movie and more like playing a video game, where our choices, our intentions, directly influence the unfolding reality of the game itself.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. But this whole thing raises so many more questions. Like, if our thoughts can influence the quantum world, does that mean we have way more control over our reality than we think? What about free will? Is it all just quantum dice rolls, or do we have some say in how things turn out?
Those are the questions, aren't they? And they're not just philosophical questions anymore. They're becoming increasingly relevant to our understanding of the physical world, even as we dive deeper into things like artificial intelligence.
Right, because if we're talking about creating artificial consciousness, don't we need to figure out what that even means first?
Mm.
Like, what are we trying to replicate if consciousness is this quantum phenomenon?
Exactly. It's like trying to bake a cake without knowing what ingredients to use or how they interact with each other.
And we might end up with something that looks like a cake, but doesn't taste anything like it.
Or maybe it tastes even better than we could have imagined. The point is, we're still figuring out the recipe for consciousness, and quantum mechanics might just be that secret ingredient we've been missing all along.
It's a delicious mystery, isn't it? Full of tantalizing possibilities. I don't know about you, but I'm even more curious about consciousness now than I was before we started this whole deep dive.
That's the beauty of exploring these big questions. They lead us down paths we never could have predicted, and often leave us with more questions than answers.
Which, when you think about it, is what makes the universe so endlessly fascinating. There's always more to discover, more to learn, more to ponder.
And that's what makes these deep dives so much fun. So, to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this wild ride through the quantum realm of consciousness.
Keep those brains buzzing, folks, and until next time, remember, reality might be a lot stranger and more wonderful than we could ever imagine.